Hi, Scott Sattler, Managing Director of Complete Corporate Services. The following educational presentation covers modules surrounding topics demonstrating how lawyers can use investigators to assist in areas of law such as commercial, family, criminal, and personal injury. I hope you find the use of investigators by the legal industry helpful.
Welcome to the course Use of Investigators by the Legal Industry. My name is Roisin and I will narrate this course. Module 1, Introduction. Welcome to the course Use of Investigators by the Legal Industry, where you will learn about the use of private investigators in different sectors of the legal industry. The objective of this course is to provide you with a range of necessary information or education about the investigation industry, how it provides support services to the legal industry, and important knowledge relating to the management of investigators. We'll start with some information about the sector. It is best to start with the history and the foundation of the industry. In 1833, a French soldier, sailor, and mercenary, Eugene Francois Vidocq, founded an organisation known as the Office of the Universal Information for Commerce and Industry. Eugene was the first to create plaster casts of shoe impressions, was credited with introducing record-keeping to the industry, entered ballistics into criminal investigations, and by many he was considered the father of criminology. Moving forward to 1850, Allan Pinkerton established America's first private detective agency, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Being a cutting-edge industry, in 1856 Pinkerton hired the first female private detective in America. Pinkerton eventually got offside with some unions in several states, with several states passing what was known as anti-Pinkerton laws to prevent the deployment of his strike-breaking strategies. Pinkerton also assisted in preventing an assassination attempt of President-elect Abraham Lincoln. In hindsight, he should have been retained permanently. We'll now consider the history of investigators in Australia. By 1889, references to investigators in Australia started to appear in newspaper stories. In 1907, a New South Wales judge heard during a divorce trial that a husband had paid a private investigator to reside in his wife's boarding house to obtain evidence. The judge was recorded as saying, "Private investigators belong to a very dangerous class and they should be watched, but they are a necessary class carrying out unpleasant duties." It is worth noting the investigator was paid £2 per week for this task, lower than the minimum wage of £2 and 2 shillings per week at the time. Even as early as the 1930s, there were calls to introduce a licensing regime for private investigators, with the very first state to adopt this proposal being South Australia in 1951. Regulation was even required surrounding the job title. At the time, there was a lot of fear around the use of detective as a term due to the implication of a police or government role. Some states went to terms like private inquiry agent. However, the general name that is accepted across the board nowadays is private investigator. Investigators commonly and frequently appeared in divorce cases up until the 1970s, but in the 1970s, the laws were changed to allow no-fault divorce. Before this, couples would need to provide evidence that the relationship had dissolved. In some cases, this resulted in investigators being hired to photograph their own clients in adulterous acts and then give evidence to the court of their client's misconduct. The matter of Bug and Day is one of the oldest High Court references to a private investigator. Let's now consider the definition of a private investigator. The duties and roles of an investigator became subject to stronger definitions and outlined the government's expectations. Section 6 of the Security Providers Act 1993, Queensland, provides the following description of what a private investigator is. A private investigator is a person who, for reward, A, obtains and gives private information about another person without the other person's express consent, or B, carries out surveillance for obtaining private information about another person without the other person's express consent, or C, investigates the disappearance of a missing person. We will now consider legislation and regulations. Private investigators, security, and other related activities in Australia are regulated by the following legislation and regulations. New South Wales is regulated through the Security Industry Amendment Private Investigators Act 2016 and the Security Industry Regulation 2007. In Queensland, there is the Security Providers Act 1993, the Security Providers Crowd Controller Code of Practice Regulation 2008, the Security Providers Security Firm Code of Practice Regulation 2008, and the Security Providers Regulation 2008. In Victoria, there is the Private Security Act 2004 and the Private Security Regulations 2005. In South Australia, there is the Security and Investigation Agents Act 1995 and the Security and Investigation Agents Regulations 1996. In Western Australia, there is the Security and Related Activities Control Act 1996 and the Security and Related Activities Control Regulations 1997. In the Northern Territory, there is the Private Security Act, the Private Security Crowd Controllers Regulations, the Private Security Firms Regulations, and the Private Security Office Regulations. In Tasmania, there is the Security and Investigations Agents Act and the regulations. In the Australian Capital Territory, there are the Security Industry Act 2003 and the Security Industry Regulations. Each state and territory has its own regulator. The regulator of private investigators in Queensland is the Office of Fair Trading. In New South Wales, the New South Wales Police. In Victoria, it's handled by the Victoria Police Licensing and Regulation Division. In South Australia, it's the South Australia Consumer and Business Services. In Western Australia, it is the Western Australia Police Licensing Services. In the Northern Territory, it's the Northern Territory Local Courts. In Tasmania, Consumer, Business and Occupational Services. And in the ACT, no licence is required. Legislation in Queensland requires that a person operating as an investigator be of good character and undergo a criminal history check as per Section 12 of the Act. There is also a requirement for fingerprinting. Regulations include minimum education standards for those applying for an investigator's licence. The current minimum standard is a Certificate 3 in Investigative Services. You should never be concerned about asking for an investigator's licence or looking it up through the government web search facility. However, Complete Corporate Services prides itself on utilising individuals with unique skill sets and educational backgrounds that exceed these minimum requirements. Amongst investigators at Complete Corporate Services, you will find a range of individuals with legal qualifications, law enforcement backgrounds in journalism, policing, and even sporting and media backgrounds. Being legally compliant, educated, and achieving minimum standards of character are the attributes of a good investigator. These need to be accompanied by several aspects and considerations. Firstly, can your investigator take instructions? Can your investigator supply what you need? Can your investigator meet your objectives? Does your investigator understand and move toward achieving your goals? Secondly, what was the result of the investigation? Was the reporting of a high standard, and can that be presented in court if the need arises? Can you trust the findings of your investigator? Have they reported truthfully and accurately? As helpful as an investigator who believes in a client's case can be, it may be more beneficial for you to be alerted to potential witnesses who can impede your case. There is nothing to be gained by an investigator who conceals evidence. There is just as much opportunity for your opposition to locate it as your team. At the conclusion of the matter, a good investigator should provide you with a quality report that is competent and reliable. The investigator should also be competent and robust in their ability to give evidence in court to back up that report if the need arises. It should go without saying, a good investigator should be agreeable and pleasant when dealing with people. For example, if an investigator you utilise is challenging to deal with and you're his paying client, it may only be worse for the witnesses you need to obtain information from. In addition to having a diverse background and training, a good investigator should come equipped with a range of high-quality contacts, because the old maxim is correct: it's not what you know, it's who you know. Your investigator needs to be a problem solver and a solution provider who thinks outside the square to get you the best result possible. Finally, let's consider the law of privilege. When using private investigators to prepare for litigation or defence, it is important to consider privilege aspects. In Australia, legal professional privilege protects the confidential, privileged communications from disclosure under compulsion of statute or court. The privilege is attached to the client, not the lawyer. Legal professional privilege permits parties, such as external investigators, to discuss information and matters freely with solicitors without being concerned that such material will form evidence in legal proceedings. It is important to demonstrate that services are engaged for the dominant purpose of providing legal advice in relation to proceedings or preparing for imminent legal proceedings. It is important to note that legal professional privilege does not apply if an investigator is engaged just to conduct an investigation. It must be linked to the provision of legal advice or preparation for legal proceedings. The decision in Gaynor King, 2018, demonstrates when a court will determine legal professional privilege does not apply, which in this case was when an investigator was hired under the umbrella of providing legal advice, however was really hired just to conduct a workplace investigation into procedures and policies. That now concludes our Module 1 introduction.
Thanks for participating in the presentation. We hope you found it valuable. If you require further information or assistance, please don't hesitate to contact Complete Corporate Services via email, operations@completecorp.com.au, or call us 1300 911 334.